Welcome to Equal Opportunities Committee, the 26th meeting of 2013. Please set any electronic devices to flight mode or off, please. Apologies have been received from Alex Johnson. I'd like to start with introductions. At the table we have our clerking and research team, together with our budget advisor and official reporters. Around the room we are supported by broadcasting services and the security staff, and welcome to the observer in the gallery. My name is Margaret McCulloch and I am the committee's convener. I now invite members and witnesses to introduce themselves in turn, starting here on my right.
I'm Nick Watson from the Centre for Disability Research at the University of Glasgow.
I am Marco Biaggi. I am the MSP for Edinburgh Central, Deputy Convener of the Committee. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Christian Allard, MSP for North East of Scotland.
Hi, I'm Siobhan McMahon, MSP for Central Scotland.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
And morning, John Finney, MSP Highlands and Islands.
Anne Duncan, Policy Officer for the Independent Living in Scotland project.
Sophie Pilgrim, representing for Scotland's disabled children. I'm a parent of a young man with autism and Director of Kindred.
Bill Scott, Manager of Inclusion Scotland.
Florence Garabedian, Chief Executive of the Lothian Centre for Inclusive Living and Chair of Self-Directed Support Scotland.
I'm Etienne d'Aberville. I'm Chief Executive of Glasgow Centre for Inclusive Living.
I'm Teresa Burke, Chief Executive of Glasgow Disability Alliance.
Hi, I'm Tam Bailey and I'm Scotland's Commissioner for Children and Young People.
Thank you, everyone. The first and only agenda item today is an evidence session to support our scrutiny of the Scottish Government's draft budget for 2014-15. I know that Sophie Pilgrim needs to leave the session a little early, so if you just let us know and feel free whenever you feel it's time to go. I'll now hand over to John Finney, who is going to ask questions on the human rights.
Okay, thank you, Good morning, panel, and thanks very much for all your contributions. My question initially is to Ms Duncan, and it's about your submission there and your wish that a human rights-based approach be taken to budgeting. Could you maybe expand a bit further on that, please, Ms Duncan?
Certainly. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to give evidence this morning. We appreciate it and the continuing support that we get from the Scottish Government in order to do the work that we do, so thank you for that. A human rights-based approach to budgeting, from our point of view, would mean several things, but the first of which would mean, I would suggest, participation, which is one of the panel principles of human rights. And participation in budgetary processes is quite difficult for disabled people when they are hugely oppressed by society. I think it's fair to say most of us will share that understanding of the situation. And when the organisations representing them, they're directly accountable organisations representing them, are stretched, to say the least. So that makes it quite difficult for disabled people themselves to participate in such a process. However, as is recognised throughout the Equality Budget Statement and indeed a lot various documents that have been produced as part of this process, disabled people and communities being involved in things such as this mean you can get it right very, very early on. And I've said in the past that as disabled people, we're innovative by design. You have to find solutions to lots of tricky things on a daily basis, and that's something that the Scottish Government and the public sector across Scotland should enjoy. One of the things that we specifically highlighted in our evidence on human rights as well was around the issue of social care. And we believe fundamentally that social care is an infrastructure for equality and human rights, in the sense that without social care, for example, I couldn't have got out of bed this morning to do anything, let alone to participate in my equal right to democracy and to be here today to give evidence. So we consider social care to be a key infrastructure for equality and human rights, and at this moment in time, we would recognise that the funding for that particular system is in crisis. I think it's fair to say that the elastic in the budgets has snapped. I wouldn't even say it's stretched. And local authorities are struggling. Disabled people themselves are facing a huge disadvantage as a result of that. Staff in the sector are experiencing incredible difficulties, particularly on the front line when they have to face people and say, there isn't quite enough money to give give you the support you need to fully participate in society, lead an ordinary life, and uphold your human rights. And those things, I think, in a Scotland that is fit for purpose in 2013 are something that we as a nation could really lead the way on, and include equality and human rights in our budget, in our budgeting, and recognising social care as a key infrastructure for that would be a way to do that. At the minute, there are 3 separate ways that local authorities are looking at addressing this crisis. I would say one of them is that they're setting eligibility criteria very, very high, which pays no regard at all to prevention, and means that many people are dropping off the system. And so we've got unmet needs across the piece that actually isn't recorded either. So when we're setting our budgets in Scotland, we're finding it very difficult to do that because we don't really know what the real need in terms of a human rights-based approach is. And that's something I would urge the committee to look at. The other thing is they're charging people more for services. And in recent times, we've seen a 12% increase in the charges that disabled people have paid for social care services at a time when they're living in poverty. About 47.5% of disabled people, when you take into consideration the extra costs of being disabled, are living in poverty. And then finally, they're doing a bit of a Robin Peter to pay Paul kind of thing, where they're saying, actually, you've got a Rolls-Royce package, which in actual fact should just be considered your bog standard Corsa, or whatever the bog standard car analogy may be, because it's actually just about getting out and doing what you need to do. And so for somebody to say, you've got this, could you maybe top slice that so someone else can get something, isn't really how I think we should be doing things. I don't think you can empower one person by disempowering another person. So hopefully that goes some way to helping.
That was a very comprehensive reply. I'm sure my colleagues will pick up on some aspects of that. I wonder, just come back on another couple of things. You talk about evidence driven by lived experience and the role of that and the role of advocacy, perhaps, if the panel could give a view on that, please, the importance of that.
I'm director of an advocacy agency, so should I have a get that? And I'm really talking from the point of view of children and families. And I think a huge challenge that faces those families, as you'll probably be aware, is that there's a complexity of statutory services and also benefits. And at the same time, you might have very substantial caring needs. And I particularly want to emphasise the needs of families of children with very severe disabilities, complex disabilities or palliative care. And so those families are having to deal quite often with really nursing a child, 24 hours. And if you're having, a role that cannot be taken on by staff who are not actually got nursing qualifications. So if you've got that level of demand of care in your life, and at the same time you're having to negotiate statutory services, health, social work and education, and to negotiate benefits, then really you don't have the time and energy where you get into disagreements with statutory services. And I'd pick up on the point about eligibility criteria. And there's been recent research done by the Children's Commissioner's Office, and it's shown really that there are no consistent eligibility criteria across Scotland. So basically, as a parent, you're really put through a huge amount of assessment, and at the end of it, there's very little objectivity in the way decisions are made about your care packages. So as advocates for those families, what we're doing is really trying to explain to families what is happening in terms of their own assessment and how it is that authorities have come to certain decisions about their care packages, and where we feel that really those families have lost out, supporting them through the processes of getting the care and support that they desperately need.
I'd like to bring in ATN on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, just from our experience, we work with people using self-directed supporting in Glasgow, about 400 to 500 people, and about another 120 plus in East Dunbartonshire. And in relation to advocacy, I think there's a link between advocacy and the kind of human rights issue that was being referred to earlier. I mean, our experience is that what's often at stake for disabled people when engaging with services and trying to access services is it's basically it's a power issue. It's who's got the power, who's got all the information, who's got the cards, who's got the money. And so what we should be trying to do in terms of empowering disabled people is to enable people to exercise more power in that relationship, to even out that relationship. So, for instance, in relation to social care, when people need to do things like challenge decisions or budgets or assessments and so on, countless people just accept the outcome of that because they don't have access to that support. And as a support organisation, we provide help to people in negotiating their packages and making the best use of the money. But we don't really explicitly advocate on behalf of people because we're funded by the local authority. But we refer people to external advocacy organisations all the time. And it's well recognised that there's a huge need for more advocacy organisations to be able to play that role. And unless you're the kind of person or you're part of a family that is very articulate and is able to advocate for itself, then you're not necessarily going to get an equal shot at getting access to services. And we do tend to find that does tend to be the most articulate and able individuals or families that get the results and are able to successfully challenge decisions.
And it's just on the theme of rights. I mean, Pam's outlined very eloquently there just why rights budgeting is actually tied in with people's realisation of rights. And I note that the government have, in their equality statement, have said that in future years they're looking at, they call it a children's rights toolkit, checklist, sorry. I think they have to go way beyond that. For anybody out that's heard me in speaking about the passage of the Children and Young People's Bill, we've made calls repeatedly for child rights impact assessments. And that's the level of scrutiny that I think should be given to the budgeting process in particular, for all of the reasons that people have said about the impact that has on their rights. And if the committee was going to make any comment on the budget with regard to future years, I think it should be urging the government to go way beyond some kind of checklist of children's rights. I think it actually bears scrutiny at a level which is about a child rights impact assessment. And whatever processes are in place next year, I would hope that there's a much greater lens or a much greater focus on the impact of children's rights in the setting of the budget. And I can make comment. It's actually not a lot of specific comment in the budget about children, and particularly with children with disabilities. It's very light. So that would be if the committee's got a comment to make on that, I would appreciate.
Scott would like to come in also on this.
Really briefly, just to say we very much support the EHRC's suggestion that the budget should be outcome focused, but in the achievement of human rights, and so that the rights of the child, rights of disabled people are known. The Scottish Government are signed up to them, and I was at an event the other evening that Oxfam ran, where they've developed a tool to actually look at whether you're achieving what the people on the ground, the communities, want to see achieved by any legislation or policy that affects their lives. So, there would be a way of referring it to people to actually see if the budget spend is advancing towards the achievement of their human rights, which is, we know that we're not going to do it overnight, but making progress would be a start.
Tressa?
Just adding on from what my colleagues are saying, I think it's important to emphasise in relation to advocacy that at a time when disabled people are experiencing the potential loss of the Independent Living Fund, the welfare reform impacts, more cuts to services coming, which we know is happening, and the terrible stigma and discrimination that's following from the media. That's at a time when disabled people need to be their most assertive and articulate ever. at the very time when all of these things are impacting and causing a kind of complex, perfect storm of interrelated barriers, making disabled people at their most weak. So in terms of advocacy, we would argue in the disabled people's movement that there needs to be different types of advocacy. They need access to legal representation and welfare benefits advice about the kind of technicalities of the barriers and discrimination they experience. They need advocacy that might be sought through advocacy projects like your own. They need peer support and the ability to build up their confidence and their skills and their I suppose, their sense of self-autonomy to be able to speak out and negotiate in care packages and whatever services they need. And I would suggest to the committee that disabled people not having advocacy services and peer support and self-advocacy support at this time would be like disabled people not having welfare rights support in relation to welfare reform.
John, are you with
that?
Yep. Thank you very much for that contribution. We'll move on to John Mason. John's going to ask questions about employment opportunities for disabled people.
Yes. And linked with that, the whole question of targeting funding. I'll maybe start with that and specifically look at employment afterwards, if that's okay. I mean, I think that there is an argument as to should more funds be specifically set aside by government and potentially, I suppose, by local government and health service as well, for disabled people. I mean, the government has tended in its responses to say things like, well, we're doing free prescription, so that helps everyone, so that helps disabled people. Affordable warmth scheme, the same. Energy assistance scheme, modern apprenticeships, free buses, these kind of things. So their general argument seems to be, you know, by helping these, somehow that advantages disabled people more. So I'd be interested in your reaction to that, or do you think there needs to be more emphasis on specific funding for disabled people?
Bill Scott?
Yes. But I'd go further than that. I'd say that really what is needed is that disabled people's needs are addressed within the mainstream schemes that are already there. So, you know, modern apprenticeships have signally failed young disabled people. You know, 0.5% of available places going to disabled people, young disabled people, is just a disgrace, to be honest. And it's a failure, a systematic failure, in that there were no targets for equalities groups within it. So women have been failed, young women have been failed, as well as young disabled people. And that is not saying shift the funding over there, it's saying use that funding to advance the needs of those people by, within your overall target of improving the number of young people in modern apprenticeships, set specific targets for the number of young disabled people there, the number of young women there, and maybe even in particular areas to stop job segregation. It's building up over time, because again, young women are almost completely unrepresented in construction and overrepresented in care. So you have the tools within the budget and within overall government policy, not just to spend more or spend specifically, but to actually think through how do you, again, going back to an outcomes-focused approach, how do we, within this budget stream, actually achieve what we want to achieve and reduce inequality? Because the problem is, I come from both community health and anti-poverty background, where reducing health inequalities is a huge aim of government. And it's often been thought that if you just simply improve general health of the population and life expectancy, you'll reduce health inequalities. No, you can intensify them, because if you improve it for the general population, but you leave the marginalised groups behind, then actually the gap grows, because the life expectancy of those at the top end of the income bands is much, much greater and grows at a faster rate than those at the bottom. And that's what has to be remembered within all these general policies, is you can intensify inequality rather than reduce it simply by raising the numbers that are involved, number of people in employment. numbering people in employment.
On apprenticeships bit that you mentioned, I mean, I think the target is 25,000.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's a tiny part of who are disabled people that are benefiting from that.
Yeah.
So would you say, I mean, would it be right to say that to get a young disabled person into a modern apprenticeship might be more expensive, and therefore the 25,000 should come down a bit, say 24,000, but we should have specifically within that 1,000 or something that would be aimed at young disabled people?
It might cost more, it might not. I can't say without doing the costings, but as the support is supposed to be mainly provided by the employer once the person's placed, there's a lot of funds that could be accessed through Access to Work, which is underutilised at the moment and underspent in Scotland. There are less Scottish disabled people on Access to Work support from the DWP than there should be. So again, I know that Access to Work are working with disabled people's organisations to improve the understanding that that support exists, but I think more work should be done with employers also.
Employers just don't know what they could do and what's available. I think employers don't know and think there are barriers there that don't actually exist and could be overcome with relatively modest expenditure, most of which would be met from the DWP. So, you know, I don't see necessarily that you need to reduce the numbers. You just need to utilise, again, existing support slightly better than it has been. And, you know, if the DWP are providing these funds, it's wrong that they shouldn't be accessed by young Scottish disabled people.
Etienne?
I think Bill said most of what I wanted to say, but I would endorse the kind of view that we need a more kind of robust approach to this. It seems to me that what we've had so far is an approach which has mainly been about trying to raise awareness and encouragement, provide information and case studies and so on, and in terms of the awareness of the need to recruit disabled people particularly. And that's fine as far as it goes, but you know, it strikes us that it'd be possible to use the contracting relationship, if you like, to be a bit more direct than that and actually require organisations and companies to take on a proportion of disabled people and perhaps offer training and development programmes to employments as part of that process, and that they take up those programmes as part of the contractual requirements. So something a bit more direct in terms of positive action, and that doesn't leave things to chance so much. And it's crucial that obviously the correct information and data is collected on that with a view to monitoring targets much more closely, rather than finding out at the end of the programme that we're nowhere near where we need to be. So some sort of positive action programme. And I suppose it's possible there may be budgetary implications from that in terms of providing the support, the organisational support to companies that might need it.
Yeah, I've got a yes, but the first question, which was about whether you should have essentially targeted, ring-fenced, if I'm allowed to use that word, funding. And I quite understand the rationale of building in as much flexibility as possible of funding at local level. But if the evidence is that the policies are not actually benefiting specific groups, for instance, young people with disabilities, then there has to be some remedial action, something that corrects the kind of laissez-faire, flexible approach. Because if it's not reaching the parts that it needs to reach, and you're hearing some alarming evidence in terms of young people's access to employment, for instance, and there therefore has to be some consideration about how you would make sure either that universal approach ups its game, or whether there's something particular that is done in terms of funding to try and rectify the position. But I've got another point as well, which is this isn't just about employment, because you've got evidence, written evidence from Leeds, Scotland, with regards to the reduction of places in higher education for young people with additional needs. And that's part of a bigger problem, which is the evidence that we have in terms of young people who are moving from children-focused services into adult-focused services, the transition from childhood into adulthood, which really causes a lot of grief for families and carers and children with disabilities, because quite frankly there's a gap in terms of the continued care, support and services for those children as they move into adulthood. We struggle generally in terms of our support for children from being children into adults, but particularly so with youngsters with disability, and I think that requires specific attention, and I know that from the inquiries, individual inquiries that come to my office. This is something which has been around for a long period of time and is not being improved, and actually, again, the committee may well want to make some recommendations about transition of children with disabilities from childhood into adulthood.
So if we took, say, colleges and universities specifically, I mean, would your answer be similar to what we had, I think, from Mr Scott, that actually the colleges and universities could be doing and should be doing a bit more, or is it somebody else that should be doing it?
Well, the trick is to try and find the method of exerting influence that will get the outcome that you're looking for. Now, it might be about targets, it might be about the expectations that are placed in colleges and universities with the kind of courses that they're expected to provide. It may be about culture change. I suspect it's all of those. But the fact remains, we are struggling badly to provide properly for those children that move from children with disabilities, to move from child-focused services into the adult world. And it's just sitting there as something that's been here for a long period of time and is not getting any better.
Bill Scott.
Again, a very brief point that is a key intervention period, that period between the end of school and young adulthood, because for many young disabled people, no transition is made. They're just parked for the rest of their lives. And the bit about getting modern apprenticeships for 20-odd thousand people is all of those who did get the modern apprenticeships have got an advantage now over the young disabled people. They've got work experience, they've got skills, they've got training, and they're competing in the same job market. And that leaves the young disabled people even further behind and even less likely to be able to overcome the barriers that are there for them. So when we talk about this, if you make that investment then and make a change in their life then, it can reduce dependency, which is what we all want to overcome. Nobody wants to be dependent on the state. They want to go out and get the same experiences in life as their peers, their non-disabled peers. They want to work. Many young disabled people want to work. And if you put in the investment then, you can make a real difference for the rest of their lives, reduce your expenditure on social care, etc., reduce expenditure on health, because if you park somebody and leave them at home, they'll become depressed, they'll become ill, and existing conditions will get worse. That's what we know from health studies. So, invest then and make a real difference.
Yeah. What we see with our own service users is that young disabled people are often kind of protected within children's services, and often the services are free, and there is often good support and care. Comes transition period, all those services either become the people have to pay for it, or they are no longer accessible to these young people, and that shifts really the confidence of those young people. What we see, we've got a program working with any disabled people, but into looking at living more independent lives. And what we see is that there is a number of young people who actually, through a certain type of support, have almost been institutionalized and come transition time, they don't have the confidence necessary, to go out, to look for a job, and they are almost parked themselves because, they are disabled people, and therefore, how could they have a job? And I think it's a key aspect of, again, building the capacity of individuals, in that case of young people, to stand for themselves and to have the confidence and the capacity to look for a job, for example.
Pam would like to also come in this, and then Sophie.
Just briefly, in addition to what my colleagues have said, the barriers for disabled people to getting into an employment, and including in the apprenticeships that you spoke of, are complex. And so I would suggest that they don't only focus, the barriers don't only exist in employability things. So, for example, in schools, and in segregation in schools, and I'm not suggesting we get into a huge debate about mainstream versus special education, but I do think there's something in there about if you don't see your colleagues at school or your friends at school, can you really expect to see them in the boardroom or in the workplace? And if you're not out and participating in the community, for example in sport in your local playing field or whatever, then how can you possibly expect the attitudes of employers to change when really disabled people are not seen as much out in the community as they should be? So I think there's something there that we need to think about in terms of disabled people's visibility and their participation generally. I would link to that then the issues.
Long-term process to change attitudes. I mean, would you say in the short term we should focus on the employers?
I would say in the short term, I think my message is that we need to focus on various different things. One of them absolutely is focus on employers. So we've seen focuses elsewhere on disabled people, and it's about, you can do this and go out and get work, and there's very little done for employers, and I think that's the wrong approach. I do think we need to be looking at employers, but a short-term intervention could include, for example, a national campaign funded by the government to look at the positive images of disabled people. And many disabled people are facing a bit of a crisis of identity these days. On one hand, you have to play strong to your impairment in order to secure your benefits, and on the other hand, you have to play down to your impairment in order to get work. So there's a huge crisis of identity, and I think that the time is now for something that addresses that, something along the lines of the See Me campaign that was led by and for disabled people could seriously have a massive impact on the way that disabled people are viewed by employers and society generally. The other thing I would say are there are issues of transport here as well, and I'm pleased to see that there is investment going into some of the transport schemes, but we would very much like to see the concessionary pass being able to be used on community transport, because in some cases public transport is just not going to be suitable for disabled people. If I travel with my partner, we can't travel on the same bus because we're both in wheelchairs. If that's late at night, I'm not particularly comfortable hanging about at a bus stop on my own, nor is he for that matter. And so there are things that need to be addressed there, I would say, and transport's a crucial aspect of employment, of course. And finally, I would make the point that disabled people's organisations have a crucial role to play in this. Some of the statistics that we gave in our written evidence include the huge benefits of a disabled people-run service for employment in comparison to perhaps the workfare or work choice programmes that we're seeing. And in fact, if I can find the statistics quickly, they're staggering. 82.4% gained full-time employment compared to 3.7% when the programme wasn't directed by disabled people's organisations. So again, I'd go back to this principle of participation and user-led voice and user control over some of these systems of support.
As an employer, we employ most of our staff are parents of children with disabilities, and we also have a young people service, and we've tried very hard in the past to ensure that we employ young disabled people to run that service, and that's had massive challenges as an employer. But, it really also has incredible benefits. The quality of our service is because we gain from the knowledge and experience of disabled people. There's just no doubt about it. But at any one time, I have to really think that a quarter of our staff are going to be off because of the impact of disability, because either they're ill or their children are ill. And I'm under pressure from funders to say, literally ask me, why do you employ parents of children with disabilities? And we also support families where their employers are brutal about the fact that their child may have a disability. I mean, the employers will not hesitate to hand you your P45 if they perceive you're going to have considerable time off work. I mean, that is literally happening. And what I think is that, going back to the apprenticeships, you've just got to protect those places for children and young people with disabilities, because out there in society, people are not going to give those young people the helping hand. And yet we will have much better institutions, we'll have much better employment places if you've got a caring environment where people take on board those things. Well, you know, that's something that is to the good of everybody in the longer term. It's amazing the morale that being a supportive employment, you know, does for everybody. So I really think you've got to protect those places proportionally for the children and young people with disabilities.
I'm just about to bring ATN in just now, but I'm conscious that Sophie will be leaving shortly. So is there anything you would like to add before you leave?
Just the one bit I kind of would really like to talk about is, you know, with the self-directed support, in my mind, I think some people are very against it, but I really see it as the end of institutionalisation. And I think that what happens is some people, some children, fit into groups, and those children are not necessarily so keen on self-directed support because they may fit into that particular school. But there are a lot of children and adults out there who don't fit into groups, and they need an individualised service, because otherwise they will not get something that suits them. And, you know, my son has a package of care which is about £30,000 each year, and we've been able to do something very, very individual because he has extreme levels of anxiety. But just what I really think is a very unjust is the packages of care towards the children who I mentioned before with the very high levels of disability, because I think there's assumption that parents will care for their own children, and I really don't think people know what the impact is of caring for that high level of disability on families. You know, we just see many, many families who are just really, really put to the point of breakdown because they, just the fundamental thing is they just don't get enough sleep because they don't get the respite. So I think what we really, really need, and I not sure how it works in terms of the budget, but there needs to be some greater protection to those families with the highest level of disability or medical need. There really is not adequate resources, and I think if you heard personally from those families, you know, it's to me it's something that really does need to be addressed.
Much. Sophie, could I actually come in this as well? If we're talking about your son's very fortunate that he has the support of you and your husband, but there is lots of vulnerable people out there of various ages who don't have that information to hand and know where to go for their own self-directed support. What sort of help do you feel those individuals need that isn't there just now that should be? Florence?
As a Centre for Inclusive Living, we provide information and support to disabled people to access self-directed support. First of all, often the information is there. There is information, but there is not the strategic approach from local authorities, for example, you know, to ensure that people have the right information at the right time. And that is a big setback. People need independent information, you know. They need to know about all the options within SDS, you know. And within SDS, people can choose, you know, to buy a service within a group, but also can choose to have a more individualized type of support. So people need really the information at the right time, independent of what any of the organisation giving the information wants for them. We are not, you know, when we work with people, we are not saying that's for you or that would be better for you. We support the person to make the right choice, and that is key. The other thing is that in Glasgow, in the Lothians, you know, you've got a Centre for Inclusive Living, which are able to give this information, you know, and do a good job. A lot of areas in Scotland don't have that information, then when you don't have the information, you don't have the options. You don't know about what you can, and that is a huge setback again. And that's why, you know, in our written evidence, you know, we are really making the point that if there was a national scheme, you know, to ensure that in each of the local authorities there was an independent service, you know, preferably run by disabled people themselves, you know, to do this, to provide the information, to provide the support, you know, that would go a long, long way to make SDS successful.
Fair.
Florence may not know, I'm not sure, but we're actually supported by the Lothian Centre for Independent Living. And just one point about that to make is that if you have a package of care of about £30,000 and you're employing 3 or 4 people yourself, but you also have your full-time day job, you know, you're basically having to manage payroll, and you're managing, you make sure that you get people paid on time, things go wrong, your PA's cross with you because of this or that. You really need the support, you know, of somebody who can help you with those sort of employment issues with a big pay package like that, and that's often what puts people off. But if you can get it right, then it's by far a more adaptable situation to your own needs.
Would you like to come in at this point?
Yeah, the points I was going to make earlier were about employment, but if we've moved on, which is fine. I suppose I would say that that we're still very much in a state of flux regarding self-directed support, and certainly what we're finding is that, for instance, from the professionals' point of view, sometimes we get referrals from professionals and others we don't. And what tends to happen is when people don't come to independent support organisations such as ourselves, they may be steered towards the safer options with self-directed support. And as Sophie was saying, I think if people can get to make an informed choice based on what the real options are and how it is much more empowering if it's something you want to take on, to take a much more flexible approach to putting a package together, employing your own workers, that sort of thing, then that's something that is actually achievable and possible for many more people. And we're still, I think, in a state of flux where many professionals tend to still be gravitating towards the safer options and steering people towards the safer options. So it's coming back to the advocacy discussion we were having earlier about being able to speak to somebody with no particular interest who can present the pros and cons of different options and help people make the choice that's right for them. But it's about being a bit more ambitious and aspirational in terms of the possibilities rather than choosing the safe ones.
Siobhan McMahon would like to come in on this as well.
Thank you. I might come back later and ask about local authority funding, but specifically because self-directed support has been spoken about just now, I thought we could turn our attention to that. And some of the evidence we've received, and clearly in the budget, it clearly states that the proposed budget for the rollout of the programme for SDS will be cut from 17 million to 12 million. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are about that, if you have to make the individual choices, as we just heard from Sophie Pilgrim, what constraint, if any, that would have on people. And if you think, because I heard that in a public panel recently, that the examples that you've already given and the examples that you probably will give are the exception to the rule, do you think that's the case?
Florence, would you like to come in, and then Pam?
The program within the national budget is about building the capacity of organizations, of local authorities, and of providers. You know, it's not about direct care. It doesn't give extra money to local authorities, for example, to give more support to individuals at local level. But this program, this national program, is really is a great approach from the government, because it has enabled a number of organizations, you know, to get ready for SDS and to work to have our systems ready to make sure that we can give the right information at the right time. So it's key, and we see how much there is a lot of thinking, a lot of people getting together, you know, to get ready and to make sure that that works. This funding is already dropping, you know, this year from last year, and that means that less organizations will be able, you know, to do a very good job in ensuring that SDS is a success. So I would urge again, you know, you as a committee to really highlight this, because if we want people to make the right choices, to be more creative in the way they choose to be supported, and not necessarily in a more expensive way, you know, they need to have the right organizations, the independent information, you know, for that to happen.
I'm just quickly, furiously looking at statistics here I have in front of me, but this print is far too small for me to read it out properly, so, which is well prepared as ever. The research that was done by Strathclyde University has found that the local authorities and voluntary sector organisations are at different stages in terms of implementation of the self-directed support agenda. And I think it's fair to say that there is still a long way to travel, and this research recognises that. On that basis, I think that any reduction to the budget to support people for that transformational change is probably not good news, is maybe the softest way to put it. And so I think that, you know, something might need to be done in that respect. I was going to go back slightly to respond to a couple of other things as well, if that's okay, and I'll come back later, I presume, to local authority funding as well. But one of the things that came up was about employment and disabled people being in employment. And I would say that if the right support is in place for people in employment, then as a preventative approach, you're less likely to need time off because things go well for you, and so you're more likely to be in the door as an employer. That means there are less pressures on you as an employee and as an employer, the pressures that Sophie was referring to. The other thing I was going to say in terms of employment, so forgive me for taking it back to this again, but another way that needs to be recognised is that where social care doesn't meet the needs of the individual, it's often women in the family who take on the responsibility of caring for the disabled person. And in fact, it's what's sadder is that they expect that that's their role. And that's something that I think we need to seriously look at in terms of both kind of equality strands of women and disabled people in there. So an employment agenda could usefully look at self-directed support in that sense, to look at a way to increase employability across the piece in terms of disabled people and women. But also, I employ PAs directly. And the reason, and I should say this just because we're on the subject of it, the reason I do that is because other disabled people inspired me to be able to do it. If it wasn't for hearing the stories directly and the experience of other disabled people, I would have been possibly put off, not forever possibly, but for a while anyway. And it was disabled people themselves who inspired me to realise that it was possible, and they had good support in place from local support organisations who were run by disabled people to help me do that. But I employ 7 people, so there are people in employment because of that. So there are so many different angles that self-directed support can support employability, if that's and that is a key agenda, obviously, throughout the budget, which I support. And so I think we need to consider it from that respect.
Sorry, Tam, and then Tressa.
Self-directed support, yes, good in theory, and I mean, you get a warm welcome in terms of all of the reasons that have been outlined. It's a bit like the argument, though, with regards to ring-fence funding. It's fine as long as there's sufficient funding there. And the perception is, in many instances, that this is actually an exercise in cutting and reducing funding. And in fact, we recently hosted a conference that was called It All Comes Down to Money, which was a quote from a parent. But given some of the other comments, we actually thought of calling the report You Have to Fight Every Inch of the Way, because that's what typified parents' experiences of getting services for their children. And in fact, there was a parent who was on the platform who gave an example of her daughter with very high support needs, and where she was actually in dispute with the council about the level of funding, the level of support. And when that converted into self-directed support, it was a fraction of the money which was required to actually provide sufficient, this was even just respite and care facilities for her daughter. So I think that there has to be some realism brought into what is an aspirational, an excellent way in terms of empowering people with disabilities to ensure that they get the right care, that it is genuinely self-directed, if there is sufficient funds there. And I think that's the journey that has to be travelled, and that's some of the convincing that people have to some of the convincing still has to be done, that this actually will provide better quality services, because at the end of the day it will come down to how much money is available to be able to put this into effect. A policy of which I support, but only for sufficient funds.
Teresa, and then ATN would also like to come in as well.
Adding on from what's been said, I suppose we absolutely welcome the SDS strategy, the bill. It's wonderful, the rhetoric is fantastic, but there is a realistic experience that's happening on the ground, and I know that every local authority is in a different place with this, but if you look at Glasgow as an example and the extreme need that they are dealing with, the level and the proportionate numbers in the population of disabled people with high needs compared to other areas, the pressure on social care budgets, the extreme difficulty to apply the eligibility criteria consistently. It is not an easy job, and the experience of disabled people in Glasgow, many feel that it's a cost-cutting exercise, and that's certainly not the intention of the Act or the strategy or the good officers that work in social work. And what you have is a situation where I'm certainly not an expert, and I don't exactly know how it's all allocated from an internal perspective, but from the outside it seems like decisions are made according to impairment groups, and there is perceptions of risk with certain groups. So, for example, people with learning difficulties are seen to be higher risk and more need of social participation, because if they don't have that, there's higher risks. Whereas people with physical impairments, it's much more wash, dress, feed, and the only money that's available is to do the basic needs. So the kind of more self-actualisation, raising aspirations, contact, participation, civic participation, those things are just out the window. The money's just not there to do it in many cases, and I'm not saying in all cases at all, but I think in relation to self-directed support and in relation to employability we've been speaking about earlier, there needs to be more joined-up thinking, and there needs to be certainly more resources in social care. And I think that is I couldn't tell from the budget, I couldn't get into the detail, and I'm sure it's there about what money's been allocated for self-directed support, but I definitely feel that there needs to be the possibility for disabled people to actually be able to use self-directed support for more than just, existing, which is the way it's been experienced in some areas. And going back to self-directed support and employability, the point I would raise is that disabled people need role models, they need to have their aspirations raised, they need to have their capacity built to even think about trying to use those things. And the irony is that once they think about it, they might not actually qualify for the package of funding, or there may not be a job there, or in the case of many young disabled people, there may be a college place but there's no transport, and you get into a battle between social work and the college about who's paying for it, and then they're maybe getting disability living allowance, but that's been used in a different way, and there's all sorts of complexities and barriers that people have experienced. But one absolute certainty is that without the support of each other, of other disabled people and disabled people's organisations, disabled people can't even begin to raise their aspirations to move forward.
Etienne?
I mean, Tress has essentially made the point I was going to make, but I suppose just to flesh it out a little bit from the point of view of the Glasgow experience. I think there's been a notion in the past, perhaps, that self-directed support has been about saving money. And my view has always been that it's something which potentially gives an opportunity to get better value for money, but it's not about saving money, and there's not necessarily real opportunity to save money there. What's happened in Glasgow and potentially in other places as well, as people will be aware, is that the local authority has tried to kind of take a more equitable approach to the use of the existing money, both within and between different care groups. And the overall budget, as we understand it, has not gone down, so it's not a cost-saving exercise in those terms, but it's a redistribution exercise. And the point's already been made that, as part of that process, there will always be winners and losers, and that's exactly what's happened. Some people have got services who hadn't got it before. Some people have got more services, but a great many people have had huge cuts in their packages, and we've certainly talked to people. We're working with people who've, for instance, lost packages being cut from 66 hours to 24 hours, plus a couple of days at a day centre. And the impact of that on somebody is losing effectively all their social life, their opportunity for volunteering and so on. Working with somebody who had long-standing health issues with impairment, who had no changing in their condition and no change in their budget over many years, having been reviewed, now under the personalisation scheme, getting a 22% plus cut, and, as Tressa was saying, only getting access to basic personal care, again losing all social activities. Somebody being refused night cover on the grounds that they can use continence pads. So there's all sorts of issues for people which actually go against the kind of core principles of choice, control and dignity, which should be fundamentally underpinning the way self-directed support should be impacting on people. And it's really very unfortunate, because there's no doubt at all self-directed support is a good thing for disabled people. It's fantastically empowering where it works well, but it's totally overridden by the availability or lack of availability of funds. And I do think it's it's come to such a serious situation that we need to take a long, hard look at how we fund social care, ask questions about why it's different from perhaps from the way that we think about health, in the way that we fund it. Are the historical reasons for that, which essentially we should be starting to move beyond, and that we need to take a long, hard look as a country in terms of, what are our priorities as a civilised society in terms of inclusion and support for disabled people. And I think increasingly we're thinking the only way to do that is to do something like set up a commission on social care and actually look at how we do it quite fundamentally, because the odd percentage point or percentage here and there in terms of the budget is just not going to cut it at the moment.
Pam, and then we'll go back to Siobhan.
Thank you. I would agree with everything that's just been said. Tressa said earlier on, without support of other disabled people, the systems just now and the cuts that people are experiencing is very difficult to deal with. I myself consider myself to be a particularly resilient person, but I went through the personalisation process very recently, and I can honestly say it just about broke me. It was the most demoralising, inhumane, degrading experience I've ever had. And that is after saying I still believe, I've come out of it at the other end, still believing that it is absolutely the way to deliver social care, because it does deliver choice, control, freedom and dignity in the way that the disability movement have campaigned for many, many years. But it only does that at the end point, the point at which you get the budget. It doesn't actually do that from the point at which you get your assessment or you become eligible for support. And it is that gruelling process that people are taken through that is very, very difficult. And if it had not been for the support of other disabled people and support organisations, then I would have been broken by this system. And I say that as someone who wouldn't be broken easily. And so the message I would convey is that self-directed support, similar to what others have said, self-directed support is the way to deliver social care at the end point. Absolutely, I think we can mostly agree on that. but money in the system there needs to be far much more money put into the system, and how we spend our money on social care needs to be addressed, as Etienne said. Etienne spoke about redistribution among disabled people themselves or service users, most of whom would fall under the category of disabled people if you were to take an Equality Act definition. But regardless, all of the people who use social care, it's being redistributed among that already vulnerable and particularly oppressed group of people. When if we really want to look at redistribution of resource, I fundamentally believe we need to look at redistribution across the whole of society's resource, and not only just the resource that those people who are already living in poverty, who are already oppressed, have targeted at them or at their fingertips. And so I think that's something that we have to address as a matter of urgency in Scotland. And I believe we can lead the way on this in Europe if we get this right.
Very much. Siobhan, have you got any more questions about self-directed support, or would you like to move on?
But just to follow up on one point, because I think people have answered the care package thing and on obviously with 30% reduction in the budget, what that will mean going forward. But I was interested to know, and possibly Pam might be the person to answer this, the effect of SDS on the working conditions for personal assistants and care workers. Does it affect that, given the level of funding that you have to, as you said, employ 7 people? Do you think that there's a failure there to attract, not necessarily for yourself, I understand, but the right people to the right jobs, and then when you get there, the conditions for them?
Throughout the process that I just described, 3 of my PAs changed. So I lost 3 people and gained 3 new people. Luckily, I did attract 3 other people in. But there were other circumstances. It wasn't only because of that. But the paying conditions for my PAs are, and I'm embarrassed to say this as a person who believes in good paying conditions for the workforce, are pretty awful. They get no sick pay they previously used to, but I can't pay for that now, apart from statutory sick pay. And I think that's something that we're experiencing across the piece. There is no rise. They haven't had a raise in their salary in the 7 or 8 years that they've worked for me. And so that makes it very, very difficult to recruit and retain staff. Research by Unison has recently looked into the public sector workforce. And just to have a look at this, 56.1% of them said they had their pay made worse. 59.7% had their hours adversely changed. And 52.1% had been given more duties. As a result of some of the pressures in funding for social care. Now that has a huge impact on the resilience of those care workers and my PAs who have paid tribute to every opportunity I can because they do a very difficult job dealing with me at times and don't, I think, get paid enough for it. But I think that's fair to say across the piece for disabled people. But it has a huge impact on disabled people themselves because, for example, when I was facing a cut in my package recently, I was concerned about my own welfare, of course, because you kind of have to be when it's literally the difference between getting up and going to bed or eating. But I was also concerned about my personal assistance, and what I was told was, in this climate that we live in, you should realise that jobs aren't forever, and you're an employer, and as a responsible employer, you should never have told your PAs that their jobs are forever. And that was the attitude I got when I said, please, could you give me some guidance about what I'm going to do about my staff if they're going to lose any funding? I got 2 weeks' notice of the budget decrease. And I said, these people are entitled to redundancy. And in the end, it worked out okay. But the message is there that you adversely affect the disabled person's ability to be resilient to some pretty brutal challenges that you need to face, as well as the PA's resilience to hang about. I was lucky they hung about through all this negotiation, and because of the level of support that I need and other disabled people need, they're often party to hearing this as well. I don't know how many people in this room could say they're party to hearing a reduction in their salary first hand before it's been negotiated. And so these sort of things are very, very difficult to deal with. And I would just go back again to say we must start to measure unmet need in the system properly so that we can address it. Because I believe in Scotland we're a nation of good people. Right? We're a nation of people who don't want to hear stories like this. And there are good news stories. And I'd like to say mine is a good news story. But it's not for the want of a lot of advocacy, support, resilience, and hard-won battles, to be honest. And so I think that, record unmet need and look seriously at how we fund social care as an infrastructure for equality and human rights into the future.
Thank you. Florence would like to...
Pam has covered.
Are you okay? John Finney would like to come into this as well.
Thank you, Convener. Ms Duncan, you mentioned the unmet need issue before, but we moved on from there, and I'm trying to get my head around that because Are you meaning unmet need that's never been assessed, or assessed need, and the difference between that assessment and what's actually delivered, or is it a combination of both?
I think that is an interesting question, and in some cases, in my own personal experience, I've faced the answer, well, that's your perceived need, so therefore it's not unmet because we're meeting what we think your need is. But in other cases, I've actually, I've heard situations where social workers who are experiencing incredible difficulties, as I've described, will say, we know you need that, but we can't assess you for needing that because our eligibility criteria is only on the basis of life and limb. So, for example, I said I need support to go to work, I need support to go out and meet friends, I need support to participate in community or civic involvement, engagement, etc. And I was told, and yeah, we know you do, but we don't fund that. So that's never recorded in my assessment or in the assessment of other disabled people. And in not recording that, I think whilst we don't want to admit failure, because I'm afraid if we do record unmet need, we might see that, but we're also being really honest and saying this is what it should cost us, this is all we can afford because this is the budget that the local authority have been given, and this is how we've managed to be able to divvy it up. And this is the how we've done that. If we don't record it, we're not going to even start to have honest conversations about how we're going to address this crisis in the future.
Bill would like to come in on this.
Just a very brief point again, because I think there is an issue there, John. That I was up in the Western Isles just about 5-6 weeks ago, met with a group of parents of disabled children, and the difference between individuals and families in terms of whether they'd had an assessment or not. There were people there who'd had a lot of support, had a lot of good support packages in place, etc. And there were also families there who had been asking for assessments for 6 or 7 years and not yet had an assessment. So how do you measure that need if they've not even got through the part of the process of receiving an assessment? There's no doubt in my mind that they needed to be assessed, both as parents of disabled children and their needs as carers, but also the needs of siblings within that family and the needs of the disabled child. And when that exists, that level of unmet need, we don't know what it is because the assessments aren't taking place. But as Pam says, even when the assessments do take place, it doesn't necessarily record what the disabled person thinks their need is.
Florence?
Just first of all, to give you an example, which just came up yesterday in a staff meeting, one of my colleagues explaining that by chance, an older couple who had a disabled child, adult child, heard by any chance about our services, and from there were advised that perhaps they could have an assessment, or their child could have an assessment, adult child could have an assessment. Anyway, 8 months later, those people now have support. And my colleague was saying that the dad emailed or phoned and said, for the first time in 16 years, I went to church with my wife and took her for dinner one evening, which, you feel, oh, that's great, that's nice. Actually, some of us were quite uncomfortable with that. We angry, 16 years. And anyway, the other thing I wanted to say is also in relation to the Independent Living Fund. As you know, the Independent Living Fund is now closed to new candidates. And yet, when we look at the stories of people who are in receipt of the Independent Living Fund, it has made a difference between having a life or not. I've got case studies here, and I just would like to read you a small paragraph about this person who is receiving ILF at the moment. She says, it allows me to have a life, not just be alive. My social life is a huge part of my mental well-being, and ILF allows me to make choices and not to have to justify them to anyone. She gives a number of examples, and she says also, ILF has a big impact on my relationships with my family because I am able to be independent from them, and I am not saying, help me. Our relationships are much more adult, much more equal. Another person who is actually doing some volunteering within our organization is saying having the level of flexibility that 24-hour support gives me, and it's only because she receives IRF fund that she has this 24 hours package, is very important to me. It is me. It goes a long way to shaping who I am, because I'm not stuck. I can do whatever I like. And she gives a number of examples, and she says, I can decide what I want to eat and go shopping for food at short notice rather than having to plan. I can get up and go to bed at the times I choose. I can get up to go to the toilet during the night rather than having to sleep in a wet incontinence pad. I don't have to go to the toilet to a schedule or be fed at the time I have chosen. Survival is fine, but can I not live too? So I just wanted to add to what we said so far. Not only the funds within health and social care are reducing, but now the little space of extra funding coming from IRF is closed, and that is a lot of people, not having access to any of that.
Very much. Can I move back to Siobhan? I'm also conscious we've got another couple of members that would like to ask questions as well. Could I ask, if you're answering, can you keep your answers shorter so we can get round as many people as possible? Thank you, Siobhan.
Just two examples, or we've given many examples and a lot of written submissions, but two, Learning Disability Alliance and Inclusion Scotland mentioned the increase in the charges for social work services, and that local authorities are now charging 12.6% more for those. So in light of that, I wish to ask if the prioritisation of low council tax is being achieved at the expense of services offered to disabled people, and if you think that that's justified.
Bill?
I think it is partially being funded by increasing charges on disabled people because, simply put, you cannot have a freeze indefinitely and essentially a standstill additional amount, 70 million each year, that doesn't take inflation into account and hope that services are going to remain unchanged and not diminished. And local authorities have only limited means of increasing their revenue from charges, and disabled people are one easy target for those increases. The 12% is just over the last 2 years, which is way, way above the rate of headline inflation. And that is occurring at a time when disabled people are expected to lose around, by 2015, £1 billion in benefits, Scottish disabled people. So you've got pressure on the disabled people having their benefits reduced and at the same time being faced with increased charges. And it may be the exception, but there are disabled people who are at the moment losing 100% of their disposable income in charges. And no one else in society would envisage, far less contemplate, an income tax rate of 100% above the minimum that you're required to live on. To say to somebody, you can have 3,000 or 4,000 a year because that's what income support says you need to live on, and anything you've got above that we'll take in care charges. One example, an ex-post office manager on £8,000 a year pension, which he paid for, remember, he loses over 90% of that pension in care charges, right? Why did he pay in? It's not done him any good. It's not increased his living standards because he had to retire because of the severity of his impairments at a very early age. He's got nothing of that at the moment that helps him to achieve the lifestyle that a lot of the rest of us take for granted. And, that is what care charges does. It's a very, very small part of the social care budget, 2 or 3% at most, and yet the impact on the lives of the people that are having the charges levied on them is massive and increasing year on year. And I know that the actual impact of welfare reform is going to reduce that revenue stream because people won't have the money that they currently have. They'll lose their disability living allowance, they'll lose their employment support allowance, and at that point, the revenue will drop. What are local authorities going to do? Are they going to charge those who still got the benefits even more to make up for the loss from those who can no longer afford to make a contribution? And what we're saying is disabled people are disproportionately paying for the freeze, and it can't remain in place indefinitely. I know that the council tax is a massively regressive tax, and the effect of lifting the freeze would have a real impact on a lot of disabled people in employment who are on low wages, entry-level jobs, etc., because they would not get the relief that other people would get because they've got a small income. So, we were asked about this in the last term of the Parliament, and we would prefer to see the council tax replaced with a less regressive form of taxation, rather than just that the council tax freeze is lifted. That's our preferred option. But I think we do need to get into that area. A freeze cannot remain indefinite. At some point, it's going to have to be lifted, and when it does lift, it will have an effect. So, can we think about what we're going to replace what we've currently got with? Whether it's a fairer form of the council tax, complete replacement, doesn't really matter, but it has to be a more, I would say, redistributive form of taxation than the one we've got at the moment. That will then protect disabled people as well as other low-income people, because we don't want to see those on low incomes hit either, because, as I say, a lot of those are disabled people who have actually, luckily enough, managed to get a job.
Pam and then Florence.
Thank you. I would echo much of what Bill said. One of the things I would say is that this is very much about priorities, and we see, as Bill has highlighted, the council tax as a regressive form of taxation, but we still believe that you need to unfreeze it, that it isn't sustainable. The freeze on council tax is not sustainable. It would impact on people on low incomes, as Bill's highlighted, hugely, and many of whom are disabled people. But at present, those people are people who are facing a huge disproportionate impact of the freeze on it, and so we believe that should be addressed. When we're talking about priorities, I've got some research here from Professor Bell at Stirling University, who says that the cost of care is set to rise at 3 times that of the NHS into the future. Now, that's a pretty stark figure, actually, and I think that we need to prioritise social care as an infrastructure for equality and human rights, as I said earlier on. If we see that social care is about equality and human rights, and hopefully we've been able to demonstrate that, then it is not only unfair, I would say, to charge disabled people for such a crucial service that allows them to enact their human rights, but it's almost unheard of to ask any section of society to pay to be able to literally just get out of bed in the morning in terms of their dignity and their human rights. And so we believe, and have done for a long time, that community care should be free at the point of need in the same way that the NHS is. And I would reiterate that again. But in the context as well of what I've said earlier on about understanding the cost of care and looking at how we are going to fund that into the future, the message I would say is that disabled people can't bear this brunt any longer. Because they simply can't afford it, and we need to look at how we prioritise our funding.
Thank you, Florence. Are you quite happy? I think Tressa, would you like to come in, and Etienne as well?
Just to echo in again, we believe in a fair and progressive form of tax, but that we can't sustain this freeze and, rising costs, and nobody's paying any money for the last 7 years towards that. We feel that, apart from disabled people, obviously, that social care should be free at the point of delivery. And just to pick up on something that Etienne said earlier about maybe the idea for a social care commission, or even a commission on social care located within another commission, the Equality and Human Rights Commission or the Scottish Human Rights Commission, looking at this as a specific piece of work, to consider why social care is something that's being charged for. It's a rising tax for only disabled people, and why no other part of society is paying that, but yet decisions through historical legacies are being taken that education and health and other things are free. Not that they shouldn't be free, but that we should consider it amongst looking at how all of society's resources are allocated.
Etienne?
Yeah, I mean, just to make a couple more points regarding the impact of charges, endorse what's been said already. There is some anecdotal evidence that people are stopping using services because of the fact that charges are rising and being introduced and being applied to more people in many areas. Certainly, locally, we're aware, particularly of mental health service users who've had access to support often in community centres, that those are being closed or that they're being charged for use of support services and therefore choosing not to use those services. And there's obviously huge potential damaging impacts of people not getting the support they require because they're avoiding it for reasons of charging. And the same applies to other services. People who've used day centres for years and years and years and years are suddenly starting to be charged for doing that when they've never been used to doing that before. One other point just to make, and that's it doesn't really seem to make any sense how these things work. People will be aware that carers do not generally get charged. Now, we've no problem with that. Obviously, we want to equalise it downwards rather than equalising it upwards in that sense. But it strikes me there's potentially a danger that where there's a scope to do that, you may have services being mediated via carers in a way that isn't necessarily helpful and is disempowering for the individual disabled person or the person who needs support, because in one instance it's charged and in another it isn't. And it seems to me that shouldn't be a potentially perverse incentive. It should apply equally to everybody. What carers seem to be regarded as partners in care, why the individual themselves isn't regarded as a partner in their own care is difficult to understand. And a final and obvious point is that just the issue that charges differ so widely from area to area. So we have this issue about portability, about people having freedom of movement between different local authorities, and it may be that people cannot move because the area that they might wish to move into, whether it's to get a job or whatever, the impact of the charging policy and other local policies in relation to social care means that it's impossible for them to do so. And again, that speaks against the move towards an inclusive and equitable approach right across the country.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to Christian Allard, who would like to ask some questions about welfare reform.
Yeah, the welfare reform bill, and Pat, I've already touched on it, and it's a bit of the elephant in the room when we talk about the evidence we received already in writing. And one of them particularly from Aberdeenshire Council, and I would like to speak about it because it comes from the northeast of Scotland and we have no organisation from the northeast today. They say the move to self-direct support, the abolition of the Independent Living Fund and the combined impact of the UK government's changes to welfare benefits will create budgeting challenges for those with a learning disability or enduring mental health issues. And that's backed up with STUC, who's to a certain extent welcome the Scottish Government trying to mitigate this. I would just want to know if you think the mitigation coming from the Scottish Government, if first of all is welcome, is it enough? And should it be distributed? How would you feel it should be distributed?
That's a big question. We are very, very much welcome the support that the Scottish Government has offered, and it is in direct contrast to what's been happening at a Westminster level. At least there has been an acknowledgement in Scotland of the impact of the reforms on disabled people's lives and an attempt to mitigate it. And we know that the resources that the Scottish Government have to deploy are much, much less than are available at a UK level. There's no way that you can, whether it's £2.5 billion or £4.5 billion, the Scottish budget will not stretch. And moreover, the Scottish Parliament has no powers to introduce benefits to replace that which is being taken away. I do think that the impact on learning disabled people, I really do fear for them as an impairment group. I think that a lot of the reforms are aimed at reducing support for those who are regarded as having relatively low level impairment. And I say relatively, because the amount of financial support that's put in place for a learning disabled person, say on disability living allowance just now, it's about £20 a week. But that might be the difference between them being able to socialise and not being able to socialise, and the impact that that will have on as a knock-on effect on their mental health if they're unable to meet friends, unable to get out and about, etc., is going to have an impact on the health service in Scotland and on care services, because people manage their conditions, manage their impairments, manage to lead not a great life, but one where they have some level of involvement, and all that's being taken away from them. It is bound to have a consequential impact on how they feel about themselves, and harm their health and harm their ability to manage things for themselves. So, I do think the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament have listened and are doing things. Could it be more? Of course it could. I don't want to see a single person evicted because of the bedroom tax. So I would like to see 50 million going in to support local authorities in making sure that no one's evicted. But I do appreciate the £20 million that's being put in, because it will mean far, far fewer people are facing that. One thing I would concentrate on, though, is at the moment a number of authorities, including the two largest in Scotland, Edinburgh and Glasgow, are taking disability living allowance care component into account when deciding whether or not to award discretionary housing payments. Now that means that disabled people are put at a disadvantage in receipt of discretionary housing payments in comparison to non-disabled people. And that means that they're less likely to receive support and more likely to end up going into arrears and ending up being evicted. And thereafter, their care needs, if they are evicted, are going to be a far higher order than a non-disabled person put in that situation. Advocacy needs, social work support needs, etc., the expense, etc. So I would have I hope it's part of the conditions of the extra support that's going to local authorities, that they are going to take away, taking into account disability living allowance. Otherwise, a lot of disabled people that need support are going to be denied it, and that will have real consequences for them, and losing the support of the community that they live in, the friends and family around about them, and catastrophic impact on their lives in terms of potential drug and alcohol misuse, health impacts, etc.
Thank you, Bill. Can I pass you on to Pam now?
Thank you. All of what he said, plus the things that we said earlier on about employability and about transport are two other things that I think could use some investment in terms of mitigation of welfare reforms, because if people are able to get into work, then there's that's one way of mitigating some of the impacts of these extreme and brutal reforms. So I would suggest that go back to what we said earlier on about the employability, about the financing for community transport in order to be able to use concessionary cards, etc. And then again, I would also say, and I feel like I'm saying this quite a lot, so forgive me, but if another thing that could be done is to increase the level of funding in people's pockets, so employability, transport, but also reduce the community care charge or abolish the community care charge as well. And those are three things that the Scottish Government have, the three tools that they do have at their resource, and I think they could hopefully put them into action in terms of the mitigation alongside the considerable resource that's been put into mitigating on the bedroom tax.
Christian, do you have anything else to ask?
Yeah, I could maybe ask the other member of the panel regarding, I think Florence touched on this, regarding the withdrawal of the Independent Living Fund, which will close in 2015. And we had some evidence saying that it may be better, some local authorities think, to wait to see what the impact will be. So I just want to know if you think the Scottish Government has put in place sufficient funds to meet the gap created by the withdrawal of that fund.
We don't know how much the Scottish government will be able to add or not to add to the fund. So far as we understand is that the Scottish government will try to protect the current recipients of IRF, but that is only if they get the right deal when negotiating with Westminster. Some of our organisations have run some consultations events about the situation with ILF and to respond to the Scottish Government current consultation. And what seems to come out is that people are saying that the fact that the fund is now closed to new candidates is really, really unfair. But also that if the fund is transferred, at any cost, it shouldn't go to local authorities, but go with an independent organization of some kind or an independent structure, so that the fund stays with disabled people and are not lost, in other big budgets.
Do other members of the panel agree on this, on that particular point?
Absolutely. I mean, the ILF has undoubtedly been a very good thing for disabled people over the years, and it was arguably the first direct payment. And the key element of it was its ability to provide a much more flexible additional layer of support above what local authorities were able to fund as part of their existing criteria. I think it would be fantastic if the Scottish Government could effectively fund a replacement version of it, which would do that. Because it's difficult to see, as we were saying earlier in relation to social care, how the kind of flexible, more kind of social-based, if you like, elements of people's packages, which are so crucial to what we understand in terms of independent living, it's difficult to see how those are going to get funded. Although that's ideally what we would want, is that that's part of an entitlement-based system. But if the Scottish Government could fund a full replacement for it, I think that's ideally what people would want, because otherwise we're back to a situation where some people are getting and some people are not getting access to those additional supports, and that's not fair either.
So just to add to that, the fund's been closed to any new applicants for effectively 3 years, and obviously the real impact, there are people that acquire impairments or whose impairments becoming a higher order as they get older, but the massive losers in terms of the closure of the fund to new applicants have been young disabled people, and that is a growing problem, that the very people we've been talking about earlier, those entering that transition phase of their lives, are being denied the sort of support that could enable them to actually go out and work. Without that support, it's almost impossible for them to do it. I mean, Pam could testify to that again, that if she'd lost an even larger part of her care package, she would not have been able to continue employment, not being able to contribute as a taxpayer. All of these things are in jeopardy if people can't get access. So where we very much welcome the hopeful protection of those who are already fund holders, something needs to be done for the younger disabled people who will lose out and who have already lost out.
Thank you, Christian. Do you have any more questions? Can we move on now to Marco Biaggi, who would like to ask questions about children with disabilities?
Yes, we've already touched on it with regard to the specifics of children. Perhaps, Tambeli, could you tell me which spending allocations within the budget you would identify as being crucial for childcare and support for disabled children, and how they could be improved?
Yeah, the government's quite non-specific about funding allocations for children with disabilities. If you look at the budget, it tends to come under getting it right for every child, as it does with many of the other vulnerable groups that the government has got responsibility for, or local governments get responsibility for. We've conducted some our own research on this, because in line with what the questioning about, so what's the impact of the austerity measures on, for instance, local authority allocations? And we did an FOI request. We conducted some analysis on the actual expenditure at local level. And actually, we didn't find a lot of evidence about reductions in budget allocation at local level. But what we did find was increased demand, and so that the budget was expected to go further, despite what we said earlier with regard to unmet need. The budgets were having to go further, and a real lack of consistency, which has already been touched on, about assessments and about services to be provided. And a conclusion really that, in our eyes, that the local authorities' services weren't really being impacted, but that families at a local, at an individual level, were bearing the brunt of what was occurring. So we then went back and we spoke to service providers and parents and young people, and we get quite a different picture, a much more worrying picture about what's happening. So, like, almost 9 out of 10 of our voluntary sector providers described cuts in services, described how they were having to actually be more frugal in terms of the allocation of services, bringing in waiting lists. We got parents who, in every focus group that we met with, would describe reductions in services, would describe the withdrawal of services, often without any consultation or reassessment. So these were being driven by financial considerations rather than actually based on needs of children. There was a particular gap, it was mentioned earlier about unmet need was asked about, a particular gap in opportunities for social interaction for children. Most of our legislation is about ASN, is about education, and focuses very little on the opportunity for children to actually mix outside of school. And there's a real dearth of provision for our children. And if there was an area which I think really needs urgent attention, is looking at how do we provide the opportunity for social interaction for children and young people with disabilities outside of the school setting. Because by and large, the feedback from, in terms of the schooling, was that they like the schools, despite us knowing that there are some reductions in services that are with tighter budgets. Children's feedback in terms of the school is generally positive, but the feedback in terms of their lives outside of school is that they're desperately lonely, desperately isolated, and this is bad for their development. So I think, I mean, if you ask specifically about the budget, you know, the lines in the budget, they're not specific enough to be able to comment on, because it tends to be children and family services with some commentary about the commitment for the enactment of additional support for learning. But it doesn't actually put a budget beside it, because that's the way that the budget's constructed.
If increased demand is the major driver, what is causing that increased demand in your research?
Well, actually, some of the increased demand is noted through voluntary sector because of a tightening of because of the reaction of the local authorities to actually concentrate on those for which they can provide services, and that has a knock-on effect to the voluntary sector providers. It may be that we are getting better at assessment of need. It may be that the needs are being exacerbated because of families under pressure as a result of the welfare reforms. So there's a knock-on effect which is not difficult to measure right now, especially when we know that families are going to be put in more difficult circumstances because of the withdrawal or the reduction of benefit. So I don't think it's any one particular reason, but the general picture of people having less employment opportunities or people having less benefits actually puts additional pressure on families and restricts maybe their capacity to care for their children with disabilities, whereas previously they would have been in a better position to actually do that.
Bring John Mason in on this point.
You mentioned the voluntary sector there, and I just wondered, is that patchy around the country? Because at Finance Committee yesterday I got the impression that the relationship between the voluntary sector, council, NHS is good in Highland, but it's maybe weaker in Glasgow?
Well, certainly, I can't comment on individual local authorities, but I can comment on two counts. One is, even when we did the trawl of local authority provision, it was clear that there were real inconsistencies in terms of the application of whatever thresholds for access to services. But beyond that, when you speak to voluntary sector colleagues, there is a real consistency in terms of the squeeze. And in many areas, not just this area, but in many areas of our provision to children and young people is characterised by patchy services. And one of the main challenges is to actually get consistent application of sometimes quite good legislation, for instance, additional support for learning, which is applied really very patchily across the country. And there are many areas of policy implementation applied patchily across the country. I'll give you an example. I was in a local authority 2 weeks ago. I think I can mention the local authority. I was in Dumfries, and they actually have got a social evening for youngsters with disabilities, which is heaving, which is they can almost can't match the demand. But that's unusual. There are very few areas where you will have that kind of provision, which is driven by workers recognising a need and saying we will provide that. But these are the kind of things that get put, the squeeze gets put on when the budgets are tight, because it's not part of an individual assessment, it's not part of a statutory responsibility. So these are the kind of areas that suffer as a result of there not being sufficient money to go around, and yet we know from the very strong feedback from the children in those situations that this is the very kind of service that they need, that they want, that in fact is the kind of thing that for me is central to their development.
And go into a slightly different topic. Yeah, we've talked a lot about the needs of disabled people with regard to care. What has the experience been with regard to clinical needs in terms of health? Has that undergone the same level of tightening, and are there disability groups that have had particular issues with that?
I would say that only 39% of disabled people compared to 92% of non-disabled people say they're in good health. So I think that's something that we need to look at. And one of the things, we gave evidence recently to the Health and Sport Committee on the integration of the Public Bodies Joint Working Bill. And one of the things we said there was that to get health and social care right, you need to have disabled people and their organisations around the table helping to make the decisions. In the way that I described earlier on about disabled people using their innovation and bringing strength to the decisions that are made. Not in a way that we can say, well, we'll tick the box because disabled people are there, but actually because we could help you to get this right. If we had been involved in designing buses back in the day, we would never be having to replace the fleet. And that, I mean, that's a kind of flippant example, but I think it's an important one. So I would say on that basis, it's really important to resource disabled people in their organisations in order to be able to represent disabled people at these levels, and to be able to have the sort of discussions to change the way that the health service works, or to change the way that the social care system works, right at the very beginning of the process. And I notice that whilst we recognise that in times of fiscal pressures, a guarantee of the same funding, for example, in the equalities budget and in the third sector is better than a reduction. But it's also in real terms. We all know what that really means. And so I would say that one of the messages that we've tried to get across today, and hopefully we've been successful, is that the value of disabled people's organisations in bringing the unmitigated voice of disabled people to the decision-making table is essential. And we need to look, hopefully, I would like to think the government will take a look at how they fund our organisations into the future. particularly through the equality budget and also through the third sector budget, so that we can bring that lived experience directly to the decision-making table and hope that we get it right in the first place and don't have to spend lots of time and energy, public sector included, not just disabled people, going back over things and trying to get it right at the end of the process.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, there is direct evidence that the health of learning disabled people in particular is impacted very badly. They've got 20 years less of a life expectancy than the general population. And there's a number of factors at work there in terms of how the health service is structured in terms of primary care. The demand for primary care services is growing, partially because of the DWP insisting that every disabled person is assessed to death, and I mean that literally in some cases, for disability living allowance, for new personal independence payment, for employment support allowance, where you're not assessed once, but they envisage that you're going to be assessed maybe once a year or once every couple of years, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of people to be assessed. And all of those people, if they lose their benefit, are going to go to their GP and look for medical evidence to get the benefit reinstated, which means the GP's time is diverted from healthcare into form filling and letter writing in support of the disabled people that have lost their benefit. Essential for their health, I have to say, so I'm not disagreeing with the fact that they should support disabled people, but what I'm saying is a large amount of time is being diverted away from primary health provision into form filling. And is this really how we want to go forward in terms of disabled people living in our society, and sick people, people who have long-term conditions? And a factor that then becomes really, really important is the length of the consultation. For a learning disabled person, somebody with communication impairment, etc., a 10-15-minute consultation may not be enough for the GP or whoever is seeing that person to identify what the underlying problems are, or even to identify what the problem is. So this is why many learning disabled people, unable to explain, no advocacy support, etc., in place, unable to explain how their health is being affected, are not given the treatment that they need, and therefore die earlier than they need as well. So yes, it is having an impact, and welfare reforms, unfortunately, are part of that impact on the health of disabled people, and likely to become a growing one because, again, disabled people live disproportionately in social housing, in deprived areas, etc., and that's where we've got the least primary care services. Your inverse health ratio is there are 2 to 3 times as many GPs in affluent areas as there are in deprived areas. So all of that demand is growing, and it's unable to be met by the primary care providers. So we think we need to restructure the benefit system, but we also need to have a fundamental look at how primary care is delivered.
Thank you, Bill. Tam.
We had parents reporting reductions in service for occupational therapy, physiotherapy, speech and language therapy, longer waiting lists, and even when the services were provided, particularly, for instance, speech and language, then instead of getting 2 hours per week, it would go to 2 per fortnight. And so the service is still, in theory, being provided, but it's being stretched, and it doesn't have the same impact, doesn't have the same benefit for the child. So I'm not just talking about reductions in services in terms of social care. I'm actually talking about some health services that are actually provided for children. And we found that reported both by parents and from children themselves.
Thank you. Tressa, briefly.
Just on the subject of disabled people and health, building on what's been said, I would like to kind of consider the holistic view of health and meeting health needs in a preventative way, using, for example, the Reshaping Care for Older People model, where we have health and social work, the independent and the voluntary sector, or the third sector, as it's now being called in Glasgow, working very closely on that, and to say that there is such need in an area like Glasgow where people's life expectancy, particularly with a long-term condition, is a lot less, so the need to do preventative work sooner is a lot more. And we would make a plea as disabled people that part of that strategic approach should include the resourcing of disabled people's organisations. And the reason for that is because of what we were saying earlier about the need for peer support, advocacy, self-advocacy, capacity building, raising aspirations, and actually helping people to move on in their lives. And all of that has an intrinsic value, but it also has a value towards positive outcomes, towards reducing inequality and improving the life chances of disabled people.
Does any other members have any other questions they'd like to ask? No. Thank you, everyone, for coming along today and for giving us that information. That concludes today's meeting. Our next meeting will take place on Thursday, the 31st of October, and will include evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on the Scottish Government's draft budget 2014-2015. This meeting is now closed.